and we wanted to get your take on the time in New England after the Pilgrims first settled. So I was wondering if you could give us a sense of the trajectory and the chronology from the 17th century to the 19th century in little snippets, and how we get to Congregationalism in the 19th century from the Pilgrims. That might be too broad, I don't know.
Yeah, and I'm not a colonial historian, so I would just say that the project here in the colonies in New England, it was in some sense fairly chaotic, because if you look at the records that we do have, of people having ecclesiastical councils and all those kinds of things up through the 19th century, there was no one to say that's not how you do it. And if there was a problem in a local church and they called a council, to settle it with outside people, as per the manuals, or such as they were. Well, there were no manuals. If the council didn't decide what they wanted, they just call another council. So, in one sense, Congregationalism was the established religion in New England, but yet it was extremely local. So it's kind of hard to say exactly, what the practice was like, because, up until the 19th century, there were no manuals, there were no guidebooks. There was just, churches would consult with each other and say, what do you do? And then just kind of work it out that way. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but it was, kind of a funny thing where you're the established church, such as it was, but,
yeah, the actual organization behind
you're
it.
also extremely, local to different New England towns and communities in terms of what Congregationalism actually meant.
Yeah, I think that would be quite reminiscent for a lot of people watching this of their church meetings and perhaps the disunity that happens there, because I guess that's part of the thinking, is it's so localized that it's supposed to be so focused on that particular community.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways that's the beauty of it, that that they were really averse. There's a reason why they didn't have manuals and guidebooks. I mean, that's why they came here. Yeah, they wanted to get rid of them. But yet, on this side of the Atlantic, you're not dissenters anymore. You're the established faith. And so you have to do all the stuff that you never wanted to do and impose order. And so they're in some ways surprisingly reluctant to do that in terms of church practice. They had the the Cambridge platform, but I could never really tell how much people actually cited the Cambridge platform, or some of these other other agreements when they were trying to negotiate problems.
To get a holistic sense of that must be so difficult with all these pockets of and
one of my colleagues wrote a book and the title was Tenacious of Their Liberties. And the whole idea, and he used local church records, which is a far different source than just the magisterial comments of ministers and and synods and so forth. So what you see in local churches is that people were disciplining their clergy, that they that there was a lot of people insistent that they were going to work it through themselves. So there's a lot of, I guess you could call it creative disorder, if you like.
Oh yeah. I mean, one of the reasons that we're so glad to have you share your thoughts as well is because of your book, which I had the privilege to use for my own work. So The Last Puritans, Mainline Protestants and the Power of the Past. And I found that a big part of that book was you talking about 19th century Congregationalists using the Pilgrims as kind of a device to keep people together, and read traditions. And I wonder if that's because people in the congregation were confronting these realities and they did need this kind of binding agent, this glue. So I'm wondering if you could, expand on that a bit. That would be great.
Yeah, that was my sense of things, that, Americans in general did not record or value their history well into the 19th century. And so, we have horrific stories of, just barrels of state documents being thrown into the Potomac because, what do we need these for? This was where history was going to start over, and, why do we keep this stuff? And so, the Pilgrims were no big deal. People didn't really, the town of Plymouth would commemorate them with, a lot of drinking and sermons and the kind of typical thing. But, there was not this sense that we're building on this particular past. So it's really, around about 1820, the 200th anniversary, when politicians and church people begin to deploy this story for national purposes. And, Daniel Webster's famous sermon or speech, I guess you could say, in Plymouth in 1820, ties the Pilgrims to the pioneer myth, that these are, the first pioneers, and they saw, metaphorically across the continent, and it's that same spirit that's empowering the pioneers, that empowered the Pilgrims, which is, kind of doubtful. But so there's a political reason for this. But for Congregationalists, what could be better than tying yourself to that powerful national myth as you are kind of losing your established status in New England? Owning the story is a form of cultural privilege in the 19th century. It means that you are, white. There's kind of a racial component to this, that you are, there's a social class component to this, that you are not immigrant or brown, or uneducated, but you are the keepers of this founding myth in American culture. I would, when I would speak to churches, sometimes I would remind them of the word dissenter, because that's just not used over here. It disappears. And, and of course they were, the establishment, like it or not, when they came here, but your roots are as dissenters to power. And that, I think that's a very powerful historical memory. I think in some ways better than the Pilgrim one. I mean, it's part of the Pilgrim story, but why not, latch onto that?
I think so. Maybe it's a renegotiation of how we use the Pilgrims as a historical influence and how we use that narrative, and less about a wholesale rejection of them and their legacies.
Yeah. I mean, they're an immigrant story, right? I mean, that's an American story. It's an immigrant story of people who come here and have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, of course, the story here this year is, about Native Americans and, all the horrific things that happened as the result of, European settlement here. But these people were coming here. I mean, it's just, my own family came here, from the Netherlands in the 19th century, and they never went back, even then. And that just kind of, they never saw their families ever. That's kind of an astonishing psychological feat, to be able to do that. So, it's not like we should feel sympathy for them or they were underdogs in any respect, but that, but there is another American story of people who come here out of, out of hope, with maybe not all those many reasons for hope, but they believe in the project. And that still resonates, of course.
Yeah, I mean the other speaker we've had alongside the Underground Railway Road is Manfred Kohl, who fled Nazi Germany,
Sure.
and yeah, and managed to find his way to the US. Yeah, we're bereft of hope really, without much reason to
Mhm.
expect a lot, and speaks of this great adoration for the America and the life he managed to build.
Yeah,
How
because
you might be.
Congregationalists were, by the mid 19th century, they were tiny. They were and they knew it. I always tell people they did not have a good franchise model. You had to start a community, and you had to be stable, and you had to be, have this kind of sense of local identity, and the church would be at the core of that. Most American denominations didn't bother with that, and they just spread like wildfire, Methodists and Baptists. So Congregationalists were, numerically just tinier and tinier, visible in, cities in New England and towns in New England, but really, really small, but culturally powerful, because, of what they represented. And I think they really worked hard to, that mythology. If you go to Chicago, some Midwestern city, or San Francisco on the West Coast, the Congregational Church would have a Forefathers Day or a New England Day. And, this was for wealthy, educated, white people with Northeastern US connections. And of course, this kind of Anglophile thing going on, really. Very much so. So, there was a sense of a little bit of snob appeal to some of this, quite frankly, in Congregational churches.
I wanted to end as well thinking about not just talking about your book, but obviously your lengthy work with the Congregational Library in Boston as the director, about whether the library has tried to combat any of these myths, or any of the, you mentioned triumphalism earlier, any of those interpretations of the Pilgrims, and has attempted to kind of steer its users towards different interpretations of the Promised Land, or just to think more critically about the legacies of Congregationalism.
But, we spent a great deal of time thinking about this and preparing for this. And of course, we had events planned and all these other kind of wonderful things. But we did put together a 4-part curriculum for churches. And I would stress to people that it was about being historically responsible. It's not about trashing them. That's, just judging them by 20th century, 21st century standard. It's not fair. But yet there is a moral accounting for all of us and our actions, even, long term. And it's not about adulating them. I mean, you just find people at one or two extremes. And so the curriculum that we developed and the programming that we developed, we tried to use that word, historically responsible. We're going to make sure that people know the story, because so much historical commemoration is not about the past. The town, one of the reasons we did this, because the town of Plymouth, had this whole big celebration. It was like fishing derbies and flower festivals and parades. Like, it was all about today. And oh yeah, then there were the Pilgrims, but yeah, and that was, we don't know what to say about that. So, we've had historians, on the board and in our orbit, who were, careful to tell the story with the appropriate nuance and factual, basis for it. And then you can see that, just like today, the past was ambiguous and complex, and there's personal agency of people in some ways, and in other ways not. You know, we're all formed by our circumstances. So those, you know, if we had had a normal year, that's the kind of programming that we would have been developing.
Yeah, I think we had a similar philosophy, and hopefully that's what this goes toward, is to find the nuances, to think about the legacies of the Pilgrims, and to promote a greater understanding about the past, because
Exactly.
I'm sure
Yeah.
people
What does
people
the
do
past
hold this
really
as
mean? You know,
mm,
and you know, for me, I think especially it was important to speak to communities of faith and what the past means to them. And you know, in the United States, you know, I would go into a lot of churches, and I remember one, you know, they had like a tricorn hat in a plexiglass box, you know, actually was sitting under a window and baking in the sun. You know, why in the, you know, and I just, and it was the hat of a rather famous minister that they had in the 19th century. And so I, you know, I was impressed. And they said, would you like to take it to the library? It's like, what in the world would the library do with an 18th century hat?
mm,
You know, we don't study millinery or, you know, hat making. It's just you know, it's just a kind of a semi-sacred object. Yeah, what Catholics would call a relic, you know, that's being worshipped in a congregational church. So, you know, people just don't know what to do. And we would find, one of the reasons we did our Hidden Histories project is we found 18th, 17th century church records, you know, packed
mm.
away with the Christmas decorations, you know, and in danger of being lost. People just didn't know what they were, value them. I mean, I had educated people saying, what, we came from the Puritans? You know, like there's just this, I don't know if it's American or modern, you know, just sense
Mm.
of, I don't know, why, you know,
Yeah.
history's boring, why should I care? And no real curiosity about it.
Mm.
So,
Because I mean, I found, you know, being a student, that it only takes a bit of work to make those characters and that history three-dimensional. It's
oh yeah,
you use the you know the imagery of a box. People do feel, you know, they pigeonhole certain bits of history. They see it as very flat, and then they
yeah.
delve a bit deeper, and it's filled with these nuances. It's filled with the
Mm-hmm.
complexity, and the Pilgrims, I personally think, is one of those narratives that's you know, right at the top of that. There are so many layers, there are so many narratives, both positive and negative. So yeah, it's been wonderful that you've added more nuance, and you've given more things for people to think about
Great.
as well. So thank you so much. And
Yeah,
it's
good luck to your project.
yeah, thank you very much.
Hello to Janet.